Hello, it's me and Landon again, Mr. Samingo. We're going to be talking about, in this review session, we're going to talk about all you need to know about plants. So in this particular video, it's going to be a little bit long, so I'm sorry. But again, all this is for you. All this review is so you can do well in the AP exam, so it's a little bit longer, so take your time, take some breaks, pause it. If you get tired of me, you could fast forward, I don't know. But I want to get the information to you, help you know all the material so that you can succeed. So first is introduction to plants. The kingdom is called Plantae. You should know plants, how they differ, their special characteristics, that their cells have a cell wall. They're autotrophs. Remember, autotrophs meaning they make their own energy, and they do so by the process of photosynthesis. And they're multicellular. They have 12 divisions, or have 12 phyla. The one that we talk about the most, and we spend most of our time, are the Angiosperms, or basically flowering plants. They're the largest number of species of the plants. 90% of plants are flowering plants. There's also they also have seeds, so they produce a seed with the fruit. And their key adaptations is that flowers and fruit. So remember, everything evolves. So they have their adaptations that eventually they grew to have flowers and fruits. Sporophytes, they're trees, shrubs, and herbs that flower. So when we talk about sporophytes, you hear about sporophytes, think about trees, shrubs, and herbs. And then there's two groups of angiosperms. We talked about this, called monocots and dicots. So if you want to know what a monocot and a dicot is, I have this nice chart for you. Monocots stands for one cotyledon. So here's an example of one cotyledon, and here's an example of two cotyledons. So if I look at the embryos, it's kind of like, I guess like an area where things are taking place. So this one has one in this area, and this one you can see has two. Monocots have veins that are parallel, like so, and in the leaves for dicots, they have net-like veins. So you may see in stuff like this. Vascular, you may have not heard the term vascular. Vascular is a fancy word for the vessels that get things in and out. So for us, our vascular system, you've heard of cardiovascular before, cardio meaning heart and vascular meaning veins and arteries. Monocots, they're vascular bundles, they're complex, they look like this. Whereas for dicots, they're like a ring. Monocots have a fibrous root system, so if you look at their roots look like this. And dicots have what they call a taproot. And then monocots have, the parts are in multiples of 3, 6, 9, or whatever. And dicots have it in multiples of 4 or 5. I also have a nice chart for you, the difference between monocot and dicot. It means the exact same thing as the last chart. The only difference is I give you some examples. Monocots are like grass, corn, onions, bamboo, tulips, those are monocots. And dicots, bean, peas, roses, sunflowers, those are dicots. So, first of all, one of the concepts from the AP packet that I showed you, one of the things that you need to know is you need to know the hierarchy of organs, tissues, and cells of the plant. You should know the basic organs of a plant are roots, stems, and leaves, and I think that's pretty easy for you. Types of tissue, we haven't talked about this much, but there are different types of tissue. One's called dermal. You heard of epidermis or dermis before as skin. Vascular, which we talked about, the things that transport things up and down the plant or for our body. And also ground. And then we'll talk about this later on different slides, but also they have 5 different types of cells. So remember, for our body, we have like a regular cell, we have neurons, which are cells, we have different types of cells. They have 5 different types of cells. So you should know all of these and the hierarchy of them. You may have heard of shoots and roots before. Shoots are anything that's above the ground, and roots is the stuff below the ground. So roots, they anchor the plant. You know the roots, and they absorb water, the minerals, and they store all the sugars and starches for later. Roots usually have these hairs, so you can see a picture of these root hairs right here, and they're tiny extensions of the epidermal cells, and they increase the surface area. Remember we talked about for the cells how we want a high surface area? Well, this one increases the surface area like the fold so we can get more water and more minerals. And mycorrhizae, this is an example that you need to know. It's a fungus, and it works with the roots and the root hairs. It lives there, and it helps the plant get more water and more minerals. Remember in the last example we talked about monocots and dicots. Monocots have a fibrous root. Here's an example of a fibrous root. This is a scallion or a green onion that you may have seen before, and this is an example of a taproot, like carrots. Fibrous roots have many thin roots. They're shallow. They don't go very deep. We maximize our surface area. Whereas taproots, it's just one vertical root, as you can see right here, has many lateral roots, and it's like very strong anchoring to the ground, and it stores food in this root. An example, or dicots are the ones that have taproots. Here's an example of the vascular bundle. Like if I, or not the vascular bundle, but if I cut a root and I observed it and I put it under a microscope, like very, 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 very strong microscope, you'll see that this is typical of Dicots. I have a root with xylem, and again, we'll talk about this. Xylem is the part that transports water, and phloem, which transports food. So if you can see, it looks a little bit different. This is the one for Dicots, and this is the one for Monocots. As you can see, this one has a smaller circular type thing, and this one has a big one. This one has xylem and phloem in the middle. And again, we'll talk about what these are. And in the middle of the Monocots, we have something called parenchyma. So those are roots, and then we'll talk next about stems. So here are the stems of a plant. You know where a stem is. It's an alternating system of nodes or leaf attachment. So basically, you know, the leaf attaches here, then nothing, then leaf, then nothing, then leaf. So it attaches, alternating. Its function is to display the leaves. So the whole reason why we have a stem is just so that we could show the leaves. It has a terminal bud, which is at the apex or the tip. So here's the end of my stem. So they call that the terminal bud. And then another term that you need to know, apical dominance. So the terminal bud basically prevents the growth of axillary buds. So this growth is directed upward and towards light and makes sure that, you know, that's where you stop. Axillary buds, they're located in the V between the leaf and the stem. They form branches. So here's an axillary bud here. So these things are the ones that form the branches, the axillary bud. And then when you pinch or you prune, what you're doing is you're removing the terminal bud. Here's what a cross-section of a stem looks like. For Dicots, this is the stem if I take a cross-section, and this is one for a monocot. So you'll notice that, again, they're very different. We have things here on the outside. Here's the xylem and the phloem again, the stuff here on the outside, and here mostly ground tissue and epidermis. And I have little vascular bundles on the sides. Some stems are different depending on the plant. So ones are called runners or stolons. So thinking about aspens, strawberries, grass. These stems grow on the surface and they're for asexual reproduction. That's why they call them runners. So here's one right here. So these are modified stems. So they grow on the surface. So this is a stem, but they're more on the ground. They're called runners because they go across and they grow on the surface of the ground so they can reproduce. A rhizome, you can see a rhizome. Here's an example of one. Ginger, potato, onions, they're like the iris you may have seen like on a potato, like those little eyes. They grow underground and they store food and DNA for a new plant. And at the end, we also have something called tubers, and they're at the end of the rhizomes. And then we have a bulb. So thinking about an onion has a different type of stem as well. You can see it right here. They're storage leaves, so they don't look like a traditional stem, but this is a stem for onions. And the last part, remember we talked about three main body parts for a plant: roots, stems, and leaves. So this is the leaf. You should know the leaf is, the epidermis of the underside is interrupted by stomata or pores. So if I look underneath a leaf and I zoomed in, you'll see pores. Mesophyll is the ground tissue between upper and lower epidermis. And then the parenchyma is where the photosynthesis occurs. They also have what they call a cuticle. You may have heard of cuticles on your nails before, but cuticles is like this waxy layer that's on top of a leaf, like it feels, I don't know, kind of plasticky. That's called the cuticle. So now we're going to talk about the three tissue systems. So again, we're talking about the parts of a plant. There's dermal, ground, and vascular. So dermal is a single layer. It's closely packed cells, and they cover the entire plant. So if I look back at this diagram, this blue circle is the dermal. This yellow part is the ground, and the middle part is the vascular tissue, the stuff that transports like veins and arteries. So the dermal tissue is on the outside, protects against water loss and invasions by pathogens, like disease. Again, it's there's a cuticle, a waxy layer, and they call it the epidermis or the periderm. The vascular tissue, again, transports materials. So the xylem, I tried to tell you, the xylem transports water and minerals up from the roots. That's the xylem. And phloem transports food from the leaves to the other parts. So xylem and phloem. And together they call them stele. And the last part's the ground tissue. The ground tissue, if you think about it, is like, if it's a donut, it's like the middle, or the actual donut. And it's not dermal, it's not vascular. Anything that's not dermal, not vascular, they call that ground. So its function is just for storage, also gives it support, it also does photosynthesis. The pith, they call that the inside vascular tissue, and they call the cortex the outside vascular tissue. And then the last thing we talked about, there's 5 cell types, and I told you I was going to go over them. Parenchyma is the one that we have the most, plants have the most cells, are called parenchyma. They perform metabolism, they synthesize, they store organic products. So they're the ones that there's the most cells are called parenchyma. Collenchyma are grouped in cylinders, and they support the growing parts of the plant. So they're the types of cells that support growing. So all the growth stuff are collenchyma. And sclerenchyma, they're the rigid support cells. So they're the ones that, just like very similar to these two, they're support cells, and this one helps support the rigidity. And then we talked already about xylem and phloem. Xylem for water, helps conduct it up and down the plant, and phloem, which does food like sugar and things like that. So here are some zoomed in pictures of all the 5 cells. Here we see parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. Those are the types of cells. And then we talked about xylem and phloem. All right, so new topic. So all that was about the different types of the cells. Here we talk about primary and secondary growth. So basically primary growth, you're going basically from up and down, growing in the stems. And then secondary growth, we're talking about lateral growth. So just so that you know what those topics are. Another concept from the AP exam that they will test you on is called primary growth lengthens roots and shoots. So here's the roots, and when they grow, there's different zones that you need to know. So the first zone of the roots, if we're talking about the root, and here's the root hairs, this is called the zone of maturation. Here, they're fully mature. The root hairs the root is already grown. It's already finished. The zone of elongation is the part that pushes the root tip ahead and makes the cells elongate. Zone of cell division, this is the apical meristem. This is the one where new cells are produced. So these ones are growing cells or stretching cells. These are the new cells. And the last part is the root cap. It has basically a strong end so that when it pushes through the soil, it's protected. Secondary growth adds girth. So again, I told you primary growth, we're growing up and down, and secondary growth, like growing wide. Okay, so we're talking about what they call lateral meristems. One's called vascular cambium, which is basically wood. So if you think of a tree growing like out and thicker. And also there's cork cambium, which is a tough covering that protects the epidermis. And then outside of that is bark. So here you go. Here's bark. Here's something that you're familiar with. Here's the cork cambium that we had talked about, and this part's the vascular cambium. So the bark is the one that has all the tissues outside of the vascular cambium. That's the part that you see on a tree. And here's another zoomed in version of what that is. So new topic now. We talked about all the parts of the plant. Now let's talk about what does a plant need to grow. Okay, so obviously it needs light, it needs water, it needs minerals. So if you want to grow a plant, those are the things that you need. Remember, it brings in carbon dioxide and it breathes out oxygen. And through the carbon cycle, through photosynthesis, it also creates sugars. You should know that transport, like to get things across the plant cell and the plasma membranes, we do different types of transport. We have H pluses going up and down. Remember, that's how we do the ETC. We also have H plus and neutral solutes like sucrose going back and forth. We also have ions like nitrates going back and forth, and also ions. Something that you should know or be very familiar with is osmosis. Osmosis is the diffusion of water. So remember, water likes to go, like most things, like to go from high concentration to low concentration, or it likes to go from very crowded places to less crowded places. Pure water has what they call a 0 water potential, and plant cells have a 1. The water potential equation, this is actually in your equation sheet that you need to know, is that water potential is equal to the solute potential plus pressure potential. And then the bulk flow, moving water in a plant from regions of high to low pressure, they call that bulk flow. Types of cells, there's ways to describe the plant cells. One's called flaccid, which means it's limp or it's wilting. So here's a flaccid cell. Plasmolized, so we're talking about shrink, pulling away from the cell walls due to water loss. So if there's not enough water, then the cell starts to shrink. And then something called turgid. Turgid's kind of like fat, kind of like the opposite of flaccid. So it's a firm, poofy, bulky cell. That's an example of a something that's healthy. So here are plant cells that are turgid. Okay. And here are ones that are starting to shrink because of plasmolysis. Vascular tissues, we talked about it. They're the ones that conduct the molecules, xylem doing water, and phloem doing sugars and food. So the phloem sap has sucrose, minerals, amino acids, hormones. That's where all that stuff is conducted in the phloem. And then, just so you know the routes in which things take, there's something called apoplast, or the apoplastic route. So this is through the cell wall, if things want to go through. And so this tan version is apoplast. Symplast means it goes through the cytosol. So as if you see this peach version, this blue arrow, that's called symplastic. So things either go on the apoplastic route or the symplastic route. And then the absorption of water. Again, we talked about root hairs. So they have large surface area. That's why we have all these hairs to absorb more water. And then we talked about this fungus again. It's called mycorrhizae. It's a fungus, and it has a symbiotic relationship with the roots. It has a place to live on the roots, and then the fungus, gets more water and minerals for the plant. Again, another example, another picture of how we get stuff from the root hairs and to the xylem. So you can see here, if this is the xylem, this is the vessels that take the water to the rest of the plant. It can either take an apoplastic route, where it goes all the way through the cell walls, see here, or it can go through the cytosols of all the cells. So this is the symplastic route, and this is the root hair. So it goes all the way through and into the xylem, and then it goes up the rest of the plant. When we talk about water potential gradients, so like how is the water potential different from the plant? As we go taller, we have more negative. Hold on one second. Sorry, now Landon's gone. Remember we told you that the gradients, they want to go from high to low. So in this one, as you see, as you go up in this particular case, a tree, the water potential gets lower and lower and lower and lower, and that's what causes water to want to go up a plant. So you may be saying, like, why would water want to go up a plant? Like, because of gravity. Well, because it's less crowded, the water kind of rises up a tree. Another vocab word you need to know, guttation, which is the exudation of water droplets seen in morning. It's not dew. So some people say, like, oh, this is dew. So it's not really dew, but it's really just because of the root pressure, like pushing up and going out. You see like these little droplets, and that's called guttation. When we talk about transpiration, we're talking about stomata. Remember, there are pores on the underside of the leaves, and they allow gas in exchange of transpiration. So these are the pores, these are the holes of the leaves. Now, what happens is that you have these guard cells, and these guard cells, they're the ones that, these are right here, and they're the ones that push either the pores open or close. So this cell right here, you can see it's open, and this one, they kind of close it. If it's open, they take potassium, they lower their water potential, they take up water, and then the pore opens. So you can see like how these water things become a little bit fatter, and it opens. If it wants to close, it gets rid of its potassium. So you see more red dots here, which means it loses water, which means these things get smaller, which means the cells get skinnier, and then the pore closes. So that's how the stomata and the guard cells work. The cells, they are stimulated open. So it looks kind of gross, but if you wanted to zoom in and see the stomata, this is what they look like open and closed. And if there's light or loss of carbon dioxide, then they open. If it's super hot, there's drought, there's high temperature, there's wind, that's what makes it close. So that's that. And then sugar transport. So how does sugar get up? So remember, here's my xylem, here's my water. How does that work? We talked about water potential. In reverse, we have sugar. What happens is that we make sugar in the Calvin cycle. Remember, I just talked about photosynthesis in the last video. And in the leaves, they're making this, and they want to send these sugars down to the roots so they could be stored. So in reverse, what happens is we have something called translocation, where we transport to the phloem by pressure flow. So this positive pressure, they call this from source to sink. So the source is the leaves, and the sink is the roots. So we produce the sugar, so if you follow me, 1. And then number 2, by positive pressure, it goes down, and it pushes it to the storage root down here. This is all done by what they call sieve tubes. And then the water, we load the sugar, which uptakes the water, and then we unload the sugar, and then the water is recycled. So you can see how the water is being used in the xylem and the phloem working together. In terms of nutrients, so you know that plants need food. They need plant food as well. We have macronutrients, so they need chanops. Remember that from the first video: potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And nitrogen is the most important for plants. So if you say like, what's the food thing that they need the most? It's nitrogen. They also need some. They call this micronutrients because they only need some of it. They don't need a lot of it, but they still need it. Iron, manganese, zinc. They need some of these also to live. We talked about mutualistic relationships or symbiotic relationships, things in the plant that allow it to live with, and they use it. They work together. Rhizobium bacteria. Remember when we talked about the nitrogen cycle? You should know about nitrogen fixation. When we talked about nitrogen fixation, we talked about how nitrogen is fixed, so it's used. And remember, plants need nitrogen; it's the most important. So they actually have bacteria on the outside, on its roots that supply the nitrogen for plants. So plants really need the nitrogen. So they have this bacteria that fix the nitrogen for it. And again, in return, the bacteria have a place to live. And this is now the third time we talked about this, mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae is a fungus that allows the roots to take in more water and minerals, and it allows the mycorrhizae, the fungus, a place to live. So I know it looks kind of gross, but look at these nodules right here. So on the roots, you see these little like bumps. They're the ones that help fix nitrogen, so the plants get nitrogen. Here are some unusual nutritional adaptations. So here's a epiphyte or staghorn fern. So this is another way in which they can get its nutrients. This type of, I guess it's a different type of growth, a type of shape that allows it to get the nitrogen and stuff that it needs. Also, there's carnivorous plants. There's also parasitic plants. So there's different ways in which they can get their nutrients. An epiphyte, in case you're wondering, is a plant that grows on another plant and absorbs water from the rain through the leaves. So this is a plant that's on top of another plant, and because of the water from the rain, it soaks it up, and then the water it gives it to the tree, and in return, the fern gets a place to live. Parasitic plants, parasitic meaning like parasite, so they're not photosynthetic, so they don't make energy from the sun. They basically absorb the sugar and the minerals from their hosts. So mistletoe right here, this is called a dodder, and an Indian pipe. They live on other things and suck up all the sugar and minerals from other stuff instead of making it through photosynthesis. And then carnivorous plant, I think the most common one that people are going to remember are the Venus flytraps. They are photosynthetic. They do make energy from photosynthesis, but they also need digestion of small animals to get the rest of their nutrients. So it's pretty cool that plants can eat. So close the door on that. If you need to take a break, you can pause. We're going to move on. This one's talking about angiosperms. This is kind of a review. Some of these slides will look very familiar. Remember, angiosperms have 3 F's for you to be a flowering plant. To be an angiosperm, you need flowers, you need fruits, and double fertilization. So this part was very confusing to some of you, so I'm going to go through this kind of slowly. It's kind of hard to understand, and if you don't understand it, at least I want to give you enough so you could BS it on an AP exam. What they mean by alternation of generations is that for us, remember that if we want to reproduce, we go through meiosis and reproduce, and the sperm and the egg combine, and then through mitosis that zygote grows and grows and grows and becomes another human being. But we're always all the organisms of humans, all of us, we always have double chromosomes. We always have mom and dad. We have sperm and egg, which only have half, but those aren't living creatures. Like you don't see a sperm or an egg just walking along. They're just only used for sex cells. But for plants, they actually alternate generations, meaning when they reproduce sperm and egg, but they're actual plants. Like they're living organisms. And then when they reproduce, then they do mitosis and back and forth. That's what's called alternation of generations. So you start with a sporophyte, and that sporophyte undergoes meiosis. So this one that says 2N, meaning has double the chromosomes. It goes through meiosis, and you get spores. These spores go through mitosis, so they double up and become gametophytes. These gametophytes go under mitosis, and eventually they make gametes, which is only one. And then they go through fertilization and start this process all over again. So you can see it's kind of confusing. So here I have this picture. Again, I'm going through this very slowly because, again, a lot of people were confused. Remember, in a plant, here's my egg. The sperm goes in here. This is the male part, the anther. And let's just say it gets germinated, okay? So then you get, or fertilized. So you get this zygote. It has double then it becomes an embryo, and it has a simple fruit. This simple fruit, say for example, like an apple, has a seed. This seed germinates and becomes a mature sporophyte, and that's basically the alternation of generations. And this blue arrow is when it's haploid, when it only has one, and this part right here is when it's diploid, when it has double the chromosomes. Okay, so this is a simplified version of it. I know it's very confusing, but hopefully you understand. Here's a parts of a flower. We talked about this very at length in class. You know, the male part's the stamen. It has a filament, which is this thing, and an anther. We have, in the carpel, the girl parts, we have a stigma, which is the top. We have a style, which is its tube, and then it has the ovary. We have the sepal, which are the supporting leaves, and this part right here where it meets the stem is called the receptacle. And again, we have petals. Here's another example of how the gametophytes and the alternation of generation happens. How does a male gametophyte get created? So here's my pollen sac. Here it is. Then it turns into microspores, which I have 4 of them, 4 microspores. Each of the 4 microspores basically becomes its own thing, and it generates and becomes a pollen grain. Okay. In the girl parts, to make a female gametophyte, we have an ovule. Inside of it, we have these megaspores, and then the female gametophyte is consisting of different parts: 3 antipodal cells, 2 polar nuclei, 1 egg, and 2 synergids. So this is a little bit different than a pollen grain. So here's the 2 parts. The male gametophyte, we said, is a pollen sac. It's produced in the anther and has 2 haploid nuclei: a tube nucleus, which makes the pollen tube, and a generative nucleus, which divides to make 2 sperm cells. That's different than the embryo. It's produced in the ovule, which is in the ovary, and it has 3 nuclei. So 2 nuclei for males, 3 nuclei for females. It has the egg and 2 polar nuclei. The egg is the part that fuses with the sperm, and the 2 polar nuclei, it fuses with the second sperm to make a 3N or triploid endosperm. Then, how do things get pollinated? I think it's very simple. Pollen comes into the female part, and it goes down the tube, and then again it double fertilizes. That's why it has that third F. So it transfers pollen from another anther to the stigma, and then it goes down the ovary, and then it meets up with the eggs, and I have this double nucleus right here, and I have an endosperm nucleus, which is 3N. So double fertilization, we're a union of 2 sperm cells, 1 sperm and 1 egg. They make a zygote, but then the other sperm combines with the 2 polar bodies to make an endosperm. An endosperm, you may be wondering, like, why do we make an endosperm? Why don't we just make this zygote? It gives nutrition for the embryo. The ovule, if you remember, then develops into the seed, and the ovary develops into a fruit. We also talked about this. Remember, they don't want to be fertilizing itself, so they have something called self-incompatibility. So they built in a way so that they don't fertilize themselves. They don't want to fertilize themselves because they like diversity. They want to live. They don't want to just keep. And they also, if they fertilize themselves, they're more susceptible to diseases and stuff like that. So one way in which they reduce it, you could see this pin flower where the stigma is up here and the anther is down here, and in reverse, the anther is up here and the stigma is down here. A pin and a thrum. Because they're like this, because they're different levels, there's no way that they could fertilize themselves. This is how you make a plant embryo. So we just talked about the zygote. The zygote then develops into 2 cells, a terminal and a basal cell. And then it grows and grows and grows. The basal still stays here. The terminal turns into a proembryo and a suspensor. And then it turns into something that looks like this. So the terminal cell is the one that does all the growing and the changing, and the basal cell still kind of stays the same. And eventually it grows and grows and grows and grows, and it looks like this. So we talked about fruit. Fruit is the part that encloses the seeds. It's the part that allows the plants to grow or to develop, so the fruit is the protection. We talked about 3 types of fruit. They're simple, aggregate, and multiple. Simple is 1 ovary makes 1 flower, like a cherry. Aggregate means you take many ovaries of the same flower to make a fruit, and that's called one example is a raspberry. And then if you take many ovaries from many flowers, that's when you get what they call multiple, which is an example of a pineapple. How do these seeds get around? Obviously, plants just can't go around and pass its seeds around. So it has to be either water, wind, or when animals eat it and then poop it out. That's another way in which they transfer the seeds. The seeds, normally they are in dormancy, they're resting. So think about it as they're like on pause. So if they're a growing living thing, the seed is just on pause or resting. It still does metabolism, but it's not growing and it's not developing. It increases its chances of germination when it has the right time, the right place, and the right nutrients. We talked about how it gets dispersed, and then again, it's protected by fruits. That's why fruits, they say all fruits have seeds, because the whole reason why you have a fruit is to protect seeds. Here's a seed structure. Remember we talked about cotyledons? So here's a garden bean. We have 2 cotyledons, a eudicot. Here's a castor bean, which is also a eudicot. It's kind of skinny, but I have 1 cotyledon and I have a second cotyledon. And maize or corn only has 1 cotyledon. They call that a monocot, which is here as well. So you can see this cotyledon, which is this brown thing right here. How does a seed get germinated? How do you, if you want to plant a seed and grow it, how does it germinate? There's a fancy word we talked about, imbibition, where it does not germinate until it reaches the required amount of water. Once it gets that water, it tells the seed, all right, go, unpause. So the seed starts to expand, the seed coat then ruptures, and then it triggers the metabolism to start. The enzymes digest the storage materials of the endosperm. Remember, the endosperm was the triploid, and it starts to digest that endosperm, and then the nutrients start to transfer to growth regions, and the seed just grows and grows and grows. So the radicle, the part of the seed, will turn into the roots. Then the shoot tip emerges, if you've seen a seed grow, which is stimulated by light, so it needs water and light. Then the foliage leaves, they expand, they turn green. And this is the part where they're very, very, very vulnerable, because they're just a seed. So at any point, an animal can eat it, the wind, the rain, whatever. So this is the most vulnerable part of a plant's life, is when it's just about to get out of a seed. Here's how they germinate, difference between dicot and monocot. Here's a dicot, the seed, it gets enough water, so the thing shoots out. The radicle, again, turns into the root, and then this little seed comes up, and then it turns into a plant. Monocots, like corn, you can see it looks a little bit different. Thing pushes out, the radicle again becomes the roots, and then out of this corn comes a little shoot, and that shoot becomes the foliage leaves. Again, I have fibrous roots here, and I have a taproot for eudicots. Plant reproduction, again, we talked about very briefly. They could be sexual reproduction, which means you need 2 different organisms to create an offspring. It gives me more diversity. Or you could do asexual, like budding, or these runners like strawberries. You clone yourself, and it's simpler and it's safer, but you just don't get the diversity. It reduces competition, and it benefits the farmers because it grows really fast, and it just reproduces itself. So here we're going to talk about a little bit about how the plant grows. So the tip of the coleoptile, it's the one that senses the light. So at the end of it, so you can see here, these little pink and white things, cells on the darkened side elongate faster than cells on the bright side. So if you think about this, it has a chemical messenger, and if it has enough light, the messenger, the auxin, tells the plant, hey, yo, keep growing. If it's a little bit different, like the blocks or the things that the things are offset, then the auxin, the chemical messenger that tells the plant to keep growing, is less, which means it doesn't grow as much unless it has a direct absorption of the light. So there are different types of plant hormones, just like we have hormones. Plants also have hormones. Again, hormones are chemical messengers. We talked about auxin just in the last slide. They're the ones that tell the cell to elongate and to grow. Cytokinins, they simulate cell division and cell growth. They also do germination. They also do aging as well. So their hormones, it basically tells the plant, like, okay, don't die. Okay. Gibberellins, they promote seed and bud germination also stem elongation, leaf growth, and also they do the flowering and the fruit development. So if I have more of this hormone, then it tells the, keep making flowers, keep making fruits. Abscisic acid, it inhibits growth. What happens is that it closes its stomata during water stress. So basically, if there's too much water or too little water, or this messenger basically tells the plant to stop growing and to close. and then ethylene. So there's a lot of hormones. You only need to know 5. And then there's ethylene. They're the ones that promote the fruit ripening, and they promote growth and the development depending on the species. So here are the 5 that you need to know. There's a lot, but here's the only 5 that you need to know. Gibberellin, we talked about. It tells the plants tells the fruits to grow. Another way that you can induce gibberellin is ethylene gas. So I don't know if you heard of this, but sometimes they tell you to speed up the ripening of a fruit, like an avocado, for example, to put it in a paper bag. Why they tell you to do that is that it creates ethylene gas, and that ethylene gas helps initiate these gibberellins. I don't know how to pronounce it, but they basically induce it to tell the plant to keep growing, keep ripening the fruit. How do plants move? So there are different types of movements. You may think, hey, plants don't even move at all. So why? Well, they do. So tropisms, they basically grow based on a response, and it's super slow. It's not like us. Phototropism, photo, the prefix for light, meaning depending on the light available, it will grow. Gravitropism says depends on gravity, and thigmotropism depends on touch. Turgor movement allows the plant to make relatively rapid and reversal responses. So if you don't know what turgor movement is, think of a Venus flytrap. Basically, it moves based on response and comes back to normal. Those are like the basics of plant movement. When we talk about light, plants can detect direction, intensity, and wavelength of light. So there are examples or experiments that you could run where plants will move and grow as opposed to light. So for example, if I have a plant and the light is here, it kind of moves and grows towards that light source. It doesn't necessarily go straight. It tends to go straight for us because of the sun, but if you grew a plant in a closet or something like that, and your light source was in a certain area, it would grow towards that area. The light receptors on a plant, they're called phytochromes. They have 2 of them. There's a red light phytochrome, PR, and PFR, far red light. And they switch depending on which is the greatest in supply. So if there's more red light, then that's the one that's most activated, and vice versa. PFR is the one that does sunlight. PR tends to be other sources of light, and they regulate seed germination and shade avoidance. Photoperiodism is essentially the physiological response based on the time of night and type of day. There are 3 types of plants. There's a short day plant. These are flowers that flower when nights are long, so they're used to a lot of dark. Those are called short day. Obviously, there's a short day. There's a long day, which means the day is long. There's like very little dark time. So spinach, iris, veggies are all the vegetable plants. They exist when the days are long. And there's day neutral, which are plants like tomatoes, rice, and dandelions, where it doesn't matter how long day is. So however long night is the critical factor. So for example, if you mess it up, so in a short day plant, if I have this much light and this much nighttime, the flower will not grow. If you have this much light and this much darkness, then a short day plant will flower. And here's the part which is very interesting. If I took the same time and did that same experiment again, but I did a very brief flash of light, like say for example, this is from let's just say 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. It's going to be completely dark, but there's a window where I flash the light or I have a little bit of light, it doesn't flower. So it really needs all that darkness for it to grow. Okay. In reverse, if I have this much darkness, the plant will grow. If I have this much darkness, a long day plant will not grow. And again, in reverse, if I took the same thing, but I did a flash of light at some point, then the long day plant will grow. Again, it's kind of weird, like to have a flash of light or just have a brief moment of light and that makes a difference, but that's how it works. During that critical dark period, you could see, remember we talked about PR and PFR? You could see how they activate and how it changes whether a long day or a short day plant gets activated. And then there's stress. So if you think about this, plants also get stressed, just like we get stressed. There are 7 things that can cause a plant to get stressed, and we'll talk about what it does. There could be drought or flooding, which is drought is not enough water. Flooding, you may say it's too much water, but it's not so much that's too much water, but it doesn't get enough oxygen. Too much salt, too hot, too cold. Herbivores, meaning like predators that eat plants, and pathogens, which is like disease. If there's not enough water, what happens is the plant closes its stoma, its pores, it releases this abscisic acid to keep the stoma closed and tells it to stop growing. The leaves start to roll, which makes the surface area like less and transpires less, and the roots get a little bit deeper. So all this happens if I don't get enough water. So you may notice when the plants start to dry out, if you ever had a plant and it dried out, the plants start to curve and to curl. In reverse, if it's flooding, like there's too much water and then I don't get enough oxygen, it releases ethylene, which just causes the root cells to die, which makes more air tubes to provide more oxygen to go through into the roots. If there's too much salt, the salt membrane impedes the salt uptake, so the salt membrane kind of like makes sure that it doesn't get any more salt. It produces solutes to reduce my water this potential and retains my water. So normally water wants to go out. What it does is produces solutes, so the water potential is better on the inside and doesn't leave. If it's too hot, remember evaporation will cause the water to leave. So what happens is that these proteins get heat shocked and it makes the proteins not denature. If it's too cold, we make these proteins that make it like antifreeze. Herbivores, so things that eat, like caterpillars, for example, that eat. So we have basically physical things. We have thorns. We also have chemicals like garlic and mint, which are very nasty to animals, so they don't want to eat it. And also they recruit other parasitoid like wasps. So these things can come in, and so here are some ways it could stop it. The caterpillar can eat it and then it gets hurt, or there's a chemical in the leaf and then in the saliva it basically kills the caterpillar. Also, it can recruit wasps and they lay their eggs within the caterpillars, and that can also kill the caterpillars as well. And the last thing they could do is pathogens, which is the diseases. So that's why they have that epidermis or that cuticle. And the second line of defense is that they have pathogen recognition within the leaf or within the plant, and it can kill off diseases that way. So again, sorry, it was a long video. It was a review. I hope you didn't watch it all one thing. Hopefully you paused it, got a break, or eating at the same time. But again, everything I talked about in this video, this long video, is everything that you need to know for the AP exam. So hopefully if you got confused, you can rewatch it, and you'll be ready for your AP exam. So thank you for watching, and I'll see y'all later.